So we're excited today for another episode, and we have a wonderful guest that I met through the social media channels, I think specifically through Instagram. And then I started following her on TikTok. And she's a wonderful advocate for adoptees. And her name's Nikole Shaw. Welcome. And you go by Koko.
I do. I go by Koko, but I'm also
Welcome.
known as Nikole too. So thank you.
Excellent.
Hi,
Well, we're
Koko. So
excited.
nice to have you here.
So nice to be here.
So tell us about you as an adoptee and what you're up to and why you're here.
Yeah, start with your journey. Like, where were you
Ooh,
born?
my journey. Okay.
Your journey. Yeah.
It's been a long journey.
I want to hear.
So I'll say that just as Sarah mentioned, I was in the fog probably, I would say like 4 years ago. And I had a boyfriend who was a psychotherapist, and he would see certain things and he was kind of like, maybe you want to take a look at that. And I think as us adoptees often do, we sort of go down the rabbit hole, we pick it up, we put it down, we want to dive in, and then something stops us. Like, it's kind of a process where a lot of starting and stopping, at least it was for me. And so about 4 or 5 years ago, I decided I wanted to find my biological family. So I had seen an episode of, it was a show, it was like one of those like family finder type shows.
Mm-hmm.
And I had seen, it was Evelyn Lozado, and she was on Basketball Wives, and she was trying to find her paternal grandfather. And the person whom she got to help her was this private investigator named Jay. And Jay, he's from LA. He's like a pretty renowned investigator, and he has a company called the Birth Parent Finder. And I was like, ooh, like, let me look that up. So I did. And back then he was kind of like just starting like his business and getting all these things together. He had long since been a private investigator, but was working specifically with people who had lost family members. So I found him on the internet. I contacted him and asked him if he could help me find my family. And at first I had like really, really limited information, just kind of growing up in a household where the information like wasn't readily shared. It wasn't available. My adoptive mother had a lot of feelings about us like finding our biological families. So it was like a really contentious thing to bring up. Never really felt comfortable. So I didn't have a lot of information. Like, all I knew was that I was maybe like from the Caribbean or the islands, my family was, and that my biological mother was 16 when she had me. But other than that, like, I literally had no information.
Were you adopted at birth?
So I was adopted at 3 months old. So I spent in, I don't know if you're familiar with Orangewood, Luis, in Orange County. So it's like the big orphanage organization. So I was in foster care for about like 3 months, and then I was adopted. So.
And you had other siblings, obviously.
I have
adopted.
I do. I have an adopted brother, and then I have my adopted mother's biological niece was raised. We were raised as siblings, and also like her biological nephew. Like, so, and then my dad had a son from his first marriage. So it was like there was a lot of different
blended
going on in there. Yeah. So
and were you of the same race in your?
Yeah. So a same race domestic adoptee.
Okay.
And that's a very important distinction, because a lot of people assume that I'm a transracial adoptee, just maybe because I grew up in Orange County, or
like Orange County.
Well, yeah, and like a lot of
the Orange Curtain. Yeah.
Babies are, adopted by white people. So it's like,
right. That's exactly right.
Probably more babies are adopted by white
Right.
people,
So it's like
right?
when you're
Yeah.
adopted by, same race as a Black Americans, especially like in the 80s. I mean, I'm 41, so it's like, back then, like Black people weren't really adopting kids. It's sort of like, an anomaly to have
Mm-hmm.
like to be Black and adopted and be adopted into a Black family. So that part of my story is that like my dad played in the NFL. So he was, pretty well to do, as like adoption's expensive, right? Like in some way or another. And then sort of like made his life in Orange County and stuff like that. So, um, but I really wanted to start on this journey to find my biological family because I just didn't know who I was, where I came from. And as a same race adoptee, like you are whoever your adoptive parents are, whether you're white or, people just
Yeah.
assume like maybe you might be, white and Swedish, like, like just for example, for my family, my parents, my adopted parents, they were from like Georgia and Texas, but like my biological family is Belizean and Honduran, and that's vastly different. And
Mhm.
Yes.
culturally, you know what I mean? Like there's just so many different things. So I really wanted to dive into that.
Were
And
you
so
close to them growing up? I don't mean to keep interrupting him.
my
Yeah.
adoptive family,
Yeah. Like, did you?
um, yes and no, like close in that way where I just kind of like sunk in and I just became a part of whatever they were.
Yeah.
So there was always like a barrier there,
Mhm.
especially because we weren't able to talk about adoption like really freely and openly.
Mm.
And so the closeness, it wasn't to me really authentic. It was more of like, these are your parents, I'm your parents, like, this is how things go. And then that's sort of how my life was. Um, and I was left with a lot of identity issues.
Mhm.
And then on top of that, my parents decided to take a dark-skinned Black girl and place her smack dab in the middle of Orange County in the
Yeah.
80s in an all white neighborhood so that's why I can
I was going
relate
to
to a
ask you
lot
that
of
if it
it
was like
was, and
that.
I can relate
Yeah.
to a lot of transracial adoptees in that way. I think that's also why people think I'm transracial, because I have that lens where I grew up in a very white community. I mean, we were the only Black family that lived on our street. The only other Black people that I really knew were the people that were in my family. So it was a very interesting way to grow up, a different way to grow up.
Yeah. You had like two identity things coming at you.
Exactly.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And I didn't really know what to do with that. Like here I was sort of pretending I was a part of this family, right? Because we all just blend in, right?
Mhm.
And and then knowing deep down, like as a child, that wasn't the case, and then like not being able to process it and talk about that really affected me into my adulthood. And so that's when I started to realize that like I get to be curious about my adoption, my family, my biological family, and that's what I started to do. So about 5 years ago, I was like, you know what, let me try to figure this out. So I contacted Jay. He was like, yeah, I think I can help you. But because the information was so limited, I didn't even have a last name. And Jay has access to what's called the birth index, which is basically like, the list or the records that the hospital keeps versus, like the state.
Yeah.
So
Someone
he
else told us about the birth index, which I
and
had not heard till recently.
yeah, so he was able to find my last name, like just given the information, like my family's last name, given the limited information that I gave him. So we were able to narrow down that my last name was Brackett, or my mother's maiden name is Brackett, and that to try to go from there. But it was like there was a lot of brackets like in LA, because I was LA County, Hawaiian Gardens is LA County. So there was like tons of brackets. And
Oh yeah.
like possibly we came on some like dead ends, because again, like because of the identity thing, it's like he showed me like some pictures, and I'm like, well, it could be my mom, I guess. Like, I don't know, you know what I mean? Because I don't know what I look like outside of, no, there's no genetic mirror for me to say like, oh, I look like that person, right? So that was hard. And then when we were coming up against so many walls, he was like, I think you just need to take a DNA test. So months and months had passed. The DNA testing takes a while. I took it, got it back, and I had a hit for a second cousin. And that second cousin, the universe, God, however you want to phrase it, works in so many mysterious ways, especially when it comes to adoptees. You hear these things a lot, right?
Yeah.
And my biological cousin was living in Antioch, which is like 30 miles outside of San Francisco. So I'm like, wow, this is crazy. Like, all the places someone related to me could be living in the Bay Area. So I knew that I
Just a
was
car drive away.
the car. Yeah. So I knew I was like in alignment, right? I knew like I was on the right track. And I was able to kind of narrow it down. Jay was able to to talk to a few people. But when we started talking to people, we knew that the story like wasn't good, right? Like it was, there was something that had happened that precipitated me being born, that really affected the way my biological family wanted to interact with me and how they saw me. So when I was a secret, like no one even knew that I existed. And within 48 hours of that DNA test, and with a second cousin and all that, like Jay was able to find my biological mother. And he kind of serves as a liaison. Like he's really good at that, like where he'll be the one to reach out and kind of go under the guise of like, hey, we need some medical information. Like, are you willing to give this to me? This person is looking for you, whatever. And her reaction, like she did not want anything to do with me. And in
That's
that,
painful.
it was very painful. It was, it's that secondary rejection that as adoptees, like it's always looming, when it comes to connecting with your biological family again. And it was heartbreaking. It was devastating because I felt like I had waited, at the time I was like 35, 36, like I'd waited like my whole life, right, for this moment, like just to be met like with this really harsh resistance. And so that was hard. And then subsequently, like I had matched with two cousins on there. And one of the cousins, like she was really close to my biological mother at one time. So like I was able to talk to her and sort of ascertain what happened. And what it was trigger warning, like I was a baby, like born out of violence and rape. And it was when she was like 15. And so it was a really devastating story, just how it even happened, and how it really ripped their family apart. And how even me being a secret, like I was, but I wasn't, right? Like it's like people always knew something was wrong with her, like as far as like maybe developmentally, like she had some issues and things that maybe she never dealt with, but they could never quite put their finger on it. And then my cousin Joy, her name is Joy, she talked to me about like, yeah, I remember that summer where she was pregnant and hiding, and she came over from Belize, and so just so many different things. And being an immigrant, and living like in a third world country, like at the time, and just things like that really precluded her from being able to connect back with me. So that was
And
hard.
that's sad too, because while she's pregnant with you, there's also that connection too, right? Trauma and stress, and she's just a kid. I mean,
yeah,
we have kids that's so young.
So young, so young. So I understood, at the time, like especially as a mental health professional, and people as a person who's worked with people like with trauma. Like I could understand, from her point of view, like why that would be so painful, and how like even in that moment that Jay contacted her, like she was probably back in that moment of what happened to her. So it was like she couldn't get past that. And then when I spoke to her brother, my uncle Dan, at first, like he had a similar reaction because there was something sinister and really dark about, the way that I was brought into this world. And it really it had to do with all of them, and what I maybe was a symbol of to them, the darkness around what happened to her and how it like really affected the family, and how um
like it was an altering moment in that whole family.
yeah, like it altered it. And then
Yeah.
also like what Louise was saying, just even it altered me, like my DNA, like it all, like we're talking about generational trauma, we're talking about epigenetics, we're talking about how stress hormones affect unborn children, so many different things, right? And then I got into a family that didn't respect my adoption and respect the process of like what a child would need in order to process adoption. And that was really difficult, really difficult.
It seems like most families are sort of at that level, especially in the 80s, 70s, 60s.
Right.
It's like you're part of the family and that's that. I mean, how you said
You probably, did you have a narrative of like a lot of adoptees, that you were lucky and chosen and saved?
I was in that fog for a very, very long time.
Yeah.
Especially because I grew up like relatively privileged. I mean, my dad played in the NFL, so we had access to, everything that we needed. And it was like, if you look at it on the outside, it's like I had two parents that are still married to this day. I had siblings, a roof over my head. I was never hungry, things like that, like basic needs were met. So in that way, like, yeah, I was grateful. Like I felt good about that because there was a reminder of what my life could have been, right? Like that's that thing that people like to project onto adoptees, like what would my life have been like
constantly.
Yeah, like if I would have been raised by that dad and that family, but like who knows? Like who
Right. Exactly. I know exactly what you mean, because for many years I would think, yes, I was so lucky to not have had that other circumstance. But that other circumstance could have easily been because my birth mother suffered trauma from losing me.
Right.
So but did your adoptive parents know anything about your birth? What were they told?
So that's the thing. I as I've grown up and as I've seen things and heard things, like I don't know. Like I feel like now that I've done some discovering and uncovering that they didn't. I think they didn't. I don't speak to them right now. We're estranged.
Oh, you don't? Yeah.
So I think they knew.
Are you estranged because of this? Because of your wanting to know who you are?
No, I'm more estranged because my adoptive mother had a lot of narcissistic traits that affected me. And I don't think she ever really dealt with the infertility and all of that got projected onto
the kids
or the kids, because we weren't what she really wanted. Like she wanted her own child, and then she sort of had to compromise that, but didn't do the work before that to deal with the loss of a child. So I essentially just became an understudy for a dead baby, and I had to do that my whole life, like to keep up to those standards and be that, which was hard.
Oh, extremely.
And very a lot of adoptees have that same, so many adoptions are born from infertility that isn't dealt with.
Right.
that just, it's like the adoptive baby is the Band-Aid on a sore that hasn't healed, and just, cover it up forever. So,
and as a parent now, as a
right.
mother, right? As a mother who's birthed a child, right?
Yeah.
Like I can wholeheartedly understand like how devastating that would be to lose a child and to like not be able to carry a child. Like what did women already have so much pressure like in society, to, especially back then, right? Like you were supposed to be a wife and a mother, and if you can't be that, then who are you? What's your identity? So it was such a secret, right? Like that we didn't come from her, because that was shameful. That was shameful back then. And so that shame was constantly projected onto us. And we were made to feel like we weren't enough, or we're doing something wrong, or just by existing, right? So that was really difficult. But also I have compassion for my adoptive mother, because I know that sometimes the tools weren't available back then for people.
Yeah,
to
we
process.
talk a lot
They
about
didn't
that.
know. Yeah.
And when you were growing up, were you not really allowed to talk about your adoption, or it was just,
Not at all.
wow, that's, yeah,
In fact,
that's harsh.
when my brother and I so my brother and I kind of bound up together, like in the sense that there's 5 of us, 2 kinship adoptions, we'll say, 2 domestic adoptions, and then my eldest brother who's from my dad's first marriage. So all the dynamics were really, really different. And my brother and I, who are like legally adopted, like went through the adoption system, we had similar feelings about how like we weren't able to express ourselves, like we weren't able to talk about our adoption, like it was like a taboo subject. And one day I asked him, I was like, do you remember like when I was told that I was adopted? Because like that's like a completely blank memory. Like I don't ever remember like being sat down and like, let me explain adoption to you. Although I've always known I was adopted, but it was more like, you're adopted, like you're in this family now, don't tell anybody, that's our family secret. And if you do, like you're gonna get in trouble. So we really just like, it was so, and I remember as a child being so confused, like hella confused about that. Like, just what is adoption? Who's my mom? Is that my brother? Like, is
so
he
like
my
you couldn't
brother?
tell your friends, or
No,
Yeah, that's
wow.
even,
no, not one soul except, and not even talk
So,
about
oh my
really within
gosh.
my family. It would be one thing, and it's still not a good thing, but it'd be one thing if like my adoptive mother and family were like, okay, you can talk about it within the safety of our home. But that was never the case. It was like, don't talk about it.
just don't talk about it.
Exactly. Like, just don't talk about it. And so when I asked my brother that question, like, all these years later, because him and I never actually talked. We didn't start talking until we disconnected from my adoptive parents, because we weren't allowed to. And then even in our adult years, like we were so conditioned to not do these things,
Yeah,
right?
the guilt.
Conditioning of adoptees, right? The guilt and all that, and all that projection, that I asked him, he was like, he remembered a story I'd never even heard before. He remembered when he was told, and how he felt, and just like the emotions and the things that my adopted mother told him. And then he was like, I don't think you were ever told. I think basically it was like the trickle down effect, right? Which was a lot of what I got as the last child. I was the baby. So everything just trickled down. Like, you told Maish and Eric, it'll come to me eventually. You know what I mean? Like one of
Yeah.
those. And so he was like, I don't think no one ever told you. It was just, I assumed probably that I was adopted at that
Yeah.
point or something, and then sort of my brothers and sisters, who were only 2 years older than me, were taxed with this responsibility of letting me know, what was going on. So that left me.
Families are such systems, aren't they? They're really
Yeah.
systems where what you're supposed to act like, how you're raised. you just know things. I talked to my brother about this, who's not adopted, but we just knew what our roles were. What, like, I don't know how that comes to you, but you just
I'm
knew,
just
don't
kind of
say anything.
still blown away by this. I mean, I don't think I've heard a story like yours
No.
where it's just like literally you keep this a secret. Nobody outside this family can know. And we're not going to talk about it in the family. I mean, that is just, and it wasn't that long ago. I mean, it wasn't, you know, you grew up in the 80s. It wasn't like, you know, I mean, there was information, not a ton of information, but there was a little bit more information than there was, say, 20 years prior to that. That's just.
Yeah. Well, and I also think like we've talked about this like in the Black adoptee support group, like what is it to be like the cultural piece around like Black people and how Black people communicate, and how maybe it feels scary for Black people to have white people like in their business. And
Okay, I get that. Yeah.
you know what I'm saying? So it was like back then, they're like adopted them kids.
You're already
No
Black.
more
You're in
social
Orange
workers.
County.
Yeah,
okay.
like, we don't need no more social workers in our business. Like we don't.
I gotcha.
You know what I'm saying? So I
yeah,
think
that makes sense. I
think
get that.
there was a lot of that, and just kind of like I didn't know any other adopted people. Like I didn't even really understand like what that meant. Like I understand that, like, you know, the basics of it, but it metastasized like as I grew up, but my child mind still thought about it in the same way, if that makes sense. Like I was never able to grow up in that.
Did you have those feelings of, like, for lack of a better expression, primal wound feelings?
Yes. Like
Yeah.
I would have, one of the things that I've talked about on my platform is that, and so I have, I'm at the Black Adoptee, and I have a platform, you know, where I just talk openly about my adoption experiences. And one of the things that I've said was adoption, or like adoption loss, feeling like you're not anchored to anything, like a loss or a grief that's not necessarily attached to something that you can identify, especially if you don't know about the primal wound. Like, so when I was younger, I would feel these, you know, I was hella anxious, you know, like I had a lot of anxiety, like lots of like looming sadness or mood fluctuations, you know, like lots of fluctuations in my mood. In fact, it used to be like a running joke, like, oh, why, you know, why are you so moody or whatever? And then, you know, like kind of like, I don't know if you've ever seen the Paul Sutherland. Okay, so he talks about like addictions to like sugar, right? And like, that was right, like that was huge, like for me, huge when I was in fact, I still kind of struggle with that to this day.
Me too.
And not knowing all of that stuff, or most of that stuff, was related to adoption. Or, I mean, adoption is like the blanketed term like for it all, but it's attachment, it's detachment, it's, you know, the primal wound, it's you know, so many different things like underneath that, and then not making the connection, and then it all being more sort of about like me just not being able to adjust into this adopted family, right? And that's,
or relationships or anything else. I always had that. I was always moody or sad, or you know, why am I so triggered, or you know, and then I'd want to run away. And you know, Sarah and I literally, it was like when the fog comes out and you're starting to lift, you're like, what the heck? This whole time I'm dealing with this. No idea.
Relationships was huge.
Right. You had mentioned that it was a boyfriend that was like, you know,
it was
I want to,
I like to look at that, because like that's, you know.
Tell our listener about that, because what you're doing now and how that came about for you.
What do you mean, like which part?
Well, what you're going into now to specialize in.
Oh yeah, so you know, even when I was younger, like I felt like I had a desire to work in like mental health, and to like figure things out, and to figure out people's brains and things like that. And I ended up in the mental health field when I got out of college. And so and that's not what I went to college for. I went to San Jose State, if you could see.
Yeah.
But I didn't, that's not what I went to college for. I got my bachelor's degree in kinesiology. It's nothing to do with
Sports.
psychology, right? So, but as I just continued to get older and just kind of like wanting to help people, I saw a need and also wanted to dive into myself, because typically when people go into the mental health field, it's because they want to deep dive into themselves. And that's what happens, because you have to in order to be able to help people. And so I started off like within my career working in like psych hospitals and seeing this stuff, like, so then I was able to make these connections, like, oh, I can put a name to that. That's called anxiety. That's called depression. You know, that, oh, that's what that is. That's not just me being moody. Like that's, you know, something else manifests itself as mood. And so as I started to dive deeper into myself and that, I was like, you know, this is the career path that I want. So then I moved to Northern California, to San Francisco, to be a crisis clinician. So I started working in inpatient psych hospitals, like doing activities and, you know, doing like counseling and things like that. And then I went to more crisis work, where I would be putting people in the hospital, putting them on psychiatric holds, you know, and then like grief counseling and stuff like that, but all while also needing all that stuff.
Right.
Right. So
Yeah.
then I started going to my own therapy and really kind of like diving into that, so that I could be an effective like clinician. And then I made the decision recently to go back to school, because I see this need for Black female clinicians, especially like in the adoption field. And then also just in the therapy field altogether. But there's a need for adoption specialists. Like there's a need for people like me to be able to listen to people like our listeners right now,
Mm-hmm.
and who can relate, because my therapist now is not an adoption specialist, and there's a barrier. But it was more important for me to just be in therapy than it was for me to like rack my brain to try to find this person. So sometimes it's important to be who we want for other people, right?
Yes.
So that's why I really decided that I'm gonna go back to school and become an adoption specialist, so that I can help my people, because y'all are my people. Like adopted people are my people.
Mm-hmm.
And I felt more comfortable and more accepted and more understood in this community that I've ever felt in my entire life.
100%. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
We have the same thing. I mean, both Sarah and I have been to therapy, and so little has been paid to the adoption part of whenever I've been to therapy.
Yeah.
When we're on the podcast, that's when I have therapy, just the reading and talking to Sarah and what I've learned on Twitter and with adoptees. It's like, I'll literally go on at night sometimes. I don't know if Sarah does this, but to read, to kind of go, oh yeah, I can relate to that. It's almost like seeing yourself in different versions. Yeah.
And it makes me feel so validated, even like listening to you just say like, oh yeah, triggers, relationships. I'm like, whoo, that's my whole life, you know?
Yeah.
So, and then other people don't understand that. And they
don't.
It's an excuse. It's like, no, it's a substantial wound that takes a long time to heal that wound, especially if you're not able to process it. And what happens with adoptees many times, especially like people like ourselves, is that we spend our whole lives like not processing that adoption. It's like, boom, like let me process, for me, 40 years of adoption trauma, like in 2 years, right?
Yeah.
Like it's
because we spend our childhoods, you know, basically taking care of somebody else's feelings.
Exactly.
So we never got to take care of our own feelings, and nobody knew that we even needed those. It's so weird. I was thinking about it earlier today, just about how our understanding of babies now, as opposed to 20, 30, 40, 50 years ago, of, you know, that no, you can't just take this baby and give them to somebody else and
Right.
think that that's not going to hurt them.
Right. There's no
But yet,
slate.
right.
No you forgetting about, you don't just forget, and it's like I gotta write, my personal statement, and I started it off by, if I told you that I lost my family in one fell swoop, you would feel devastated for me. You would feel sorry for me. You would feel like profound empathy for me if I didn't give you any context to me losing my entire family, my culture, in just one fell swoop. But as soon as I say I'm adopted, that changes, right? For whatever reason. And I'm here to tell people and to show people, like, even scientifically, how that affects us. Like, people don't want to listen to us just chat. Like, they want facts. They want hard facts. So let me give you some hard facts about, like, how there's a pattern with adopted people in suicide, how there's a pattern in adopted people with anxiety and depression and the inability to have successful relationships. Like, this isn't just pseudoscience. Like, this is real. But there needs to be more research in it because not enough people are putting it on paper. And then we have to do all this work for people to believe that adoption is trauma.
Yeah. I think, because this adoption industry is so huge and it's so crosses both political spectrums, and it's universally thought of as a great thing. And so therefore funding and trying to get those studies funded and doing that is an uphill battle. And it's just like
uphill right now.
You have to keep fighting for that and change this narrative and just keep talking about it and yelling about it.
Right. So I love podcasts like this because it gives us a chance to speak authentically and speak real about our real life experiences as adoptees. And I think what gets lost a lot of time is that people are so committed to this idea of adoption being like this beautiful, great thing. And that's so hard for them to see the other side of that. And I've never been a person who's been like, adoption is all bad or all good. Are there people like that? And do I understand where they're coming from? Absolutely. Where I come from is a place where adoption and the system needs to be changed.
Right.
Like, we need to do things on a systematic level, which is why I want to go back to school, which is why I want to get into, legislation and to law, into policy making, and to, like, how do we mitigate some of this harm that is collective? Like, it's a collective harm. And now we're just coming out and talking about it, and the resistance that we get from that, right? Like, so much resistance because people are, again, so committed to this societal paradigm where it's like, adoption is great, you should be grateful, you had a great life, just all of those tropes that we get tired of, like, as adoptees. And where can I make a difference? Like, in my community as an adoptee, in my community as a Black adoptee, as a Black woman, consulting and just and being a voice for the voiceless.
Oh, it's so important. I'm so glad you're on here for so many people, and so many people don't speak up. They just listen, and they need this.
Yeah.
So what did Nancy Verrier say? It's the adoptees are the only people with trauma who are expected to be grateful, right? You're expected to be grateful and not talk about it. And people don't like it being talked about, honestly.
I had somebody, a woman in a work situation the other day. And I said, I have a podcast about adoption. She goes, oh, my husband and I are talking about adoption. So, and like, and I said, well, she said, I'd love to listen. I said, well, you're going to probably have some cold water thrown in your face listening to my podcast, but I will tell you, if that is really your intention, read everything you can read and do the work and really examine yourself about why you're doing this. And, and maybe think about not a newborn adoption. And, so, yeah. But
good for you that you said it's, because I've never said those things. I've had people say things to me at dinner parties like, oh, I'd never adopt, because they say horrible things in front of you, and I've just been quiet. And now I'm like, oh, no. That's not going to be my response anymore.
Right.
But,
and I think and I've also, as much as there has been resistance, like starting a platform and just being on Instagram or TikTok and just having people who aren't adopted, like non-adopted folks, like inbox me and say like, thank you. Like, I never knew that, or this makes me think twice about adopting, or this makes me think twice about, how I interact with my adopted child, or with the resources that they need, or, what do you think about this? So I welcome those questions, and I really enjoy like answering those things for people, because I think it's helpful, and I think it's what's really needed, because what you don't see is, where's all the teens? Like, where are all the teen adoptees? Like, where are all the younger adoptees, like, in the services for those children? Like, why do we have to wait until we get into like our 20s, 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s? I mean, there's so many, late discovery adoptees are just like coming out of the fog so late in your life. And when people like us can look back and say like, that is what affected me, is not having access to this information and not knowing this information like a long time ago. It's that old, if I would have known what I know now. So that's why I speak up. That's why I hop on people's podcasts and, run a platform, and want to expand myself and use myself the way God intended me to be used. Like, this is my purpose. Like, this is 1000% my purpose.
Ours too. I mean, we've
I love that. I love that so much.
Really, so grateful that you came on. I still want to probe a tiny bit, and then we can. I want to know, did you find any biological siblings?
So no. So it's very telling that my biological mother never had any more kids, never was married, never had a boyfriend or husband or anything like that. Yeah. And, being born out of violence, that's a precarious situation, for lack of better words. It's like, I might have siblings on my biological father's side, but that hasn't come up yet. I'm still sort of in the midst of trying to find that, but like, I'm not putting tons of energy behind it, because I don't know if either of you, I don't know your adoption stories, but like, they're from another country. When you bring in the other country, like that's like a whole other layer of difficulty for adoption search. You know what I mean? Like, they don't keep records and doing all that stuff, and you know what I mean? So it would be hard. So to answer your question, no, I don't know if I have any other biological siblings. Is a possibility. Yeah.
And maybe, I mean, do you feel like that the door is open? Maybe the door will open up with your mom. Maybe.
Here's what I'll say, is that people change, right?
Right. That's what I was kind of alluding to.
Change, people grow. And there was a docu-series on Netflix about, I think it was these two, were they twins? And at first they went to find their biological mom, and she was like, no. And then like 10 years later, she wanted to connect. And you hear those stories like that in the adoption community quite a bit. So for me, all I do is pray for my adoptive mother. Like, I work on her from the back end, right? Like, there's nothing I can do about what happened to her. There's nothing I can do about, the things that she experienced, but I do hold on to some faith and hope that, like, will meet each other again in this lifetime or the next, because
Yeah.
as mothers, right, we're always bonded to our children. It doesn't matter. It doesn't matter what you do, you adopt, you lose. It doesn't matter. So I believe that at some point in time we will come back together. Yeah.
I hope so. I hope sooner than later.
Yeah. And we look like
I'm sure.
twins. Yeah.
And you're so amazing. I'd love for her to know you, but it's hard to like, for her, I'm sure.
Yeah, right. And even like when I was talking to my biological uncle, and it was really hard to even get to know him, to talk to him. And I remember like when he wanted to tell me like the story, right? The story of what happened. And I had known like tidbits just from like looking on the internet, kind of like my own intuition and being able to decipher certain things. And we were talking on the phone one day, and he was just like you don't know like what happened. And he was like, when you came back around, like bullying, he used the word bully, like bullying us for information. He was like, it was like an evil reincarnate.
Oof.
So it was like, yeah, right, that shook me, right? Like those
I'm
words,
sure.
like you're comparing me to like a diabolical, like serial rapist and killer, and you don't even realize that, right? And that has nothing to do with me. So again, like so often, like as adopted kids, like we're fielding all these things from like all these sides, right? Like I got to take on whatever my biological family feels about whatever, however my adopted family feels, society feels, and that is exhausting. And I really had to think about that for a minute, like what does that even mean? Because I know me, right? Like I know myself. I know I'm a light-filled human being. I know that I'm filled with love and compassion and empathy. And to hear that that was a symbol that he saw was really disheartening.
Did he soften to that and
he did.
apologize?
He did. Like we had a really good and he was pained because essentially, long story super short, is that he was supposed to be watching my biological mother at the time. Like they were left in Belize while my grandmother came over to the United States to start the family. And they sort of like left to their own devices. Dan was like 18. My mother was like 15, and she was getting into trouble. And one day she went to a party and she wasn't supposed to be there, and she went to it was like a well-known place where like bad things happened, and it did. And then it was like videotape, like we're talking about like the 80s, right? Like so videotape, they were blackmailed. So there's so many things to the story.
Horrible.
And then Dan, I mean, he couldn't, that was too much for like,
it's massive
imagine?
Guilt.
Yeah, could you imagine? Like,
no.
And he became, I mean, there were so many things that how that affected his life. So when we're on the phone that day, I just heard all that pain that he was like projecting onto me as if I was the person that did the crime, and that is so common, like with adopted people, right? It's like, no, I'm the child, like I was the child in that situation, but they don't see it that way. They see you as a reflection of whatever like dirty little secret or whatever happens like in adoption. So that was hard. That was really hard.
God, that's really big.
Yeah.
Wow, what a story. I hope one day you write a book too.
Me too.
I started. I know.
Yeah.
And keep doing what you're doing, because I love, and come back more. You've been very quiet.
I have been quiet. I really I was dealing with some mental health like issues, just I think as adoptees, like we really kind of like go up.
You're totally allowed, but not for us.
Thank you. Yeah. So, doing that, and then just wanting to think about like how I use myself and like how I use my platform and how I allow other people to use me and the messages that I'm putting out. and how that affects other people. So wanting to be more intentional and mindful about
That's good to evaluate. Yeah.
Yeah, to
We
really
have that. Sarah and I go through that ourselves. Like what message or what do we want to, when people want to ask us about things, or we get requests sometimes and we're like, yeah, we have to think about it.
Yeah.
It's
So
important.
really wanting to do that and just kind of take a deep dive like into myself so that I can be 100% when I'm ready to do the things that I want to do for this community. Yeah.
You're just an important voice, and I'm really grateful for you coming on today. And I loved our conversation. I feel like, now we have a new friend.
Fast.
Yeah, it went fast. And we did. We have a new friend.
Yeah.
Yes, please. This was great. I appreciate you both having me on and even just validating me. Like I'm in this group, this adoptee writing group on Thursdays. It's called like through Adoptees with Voices, I believe. And it's a collective of like 25 adoptees that just kind of like sit around and write. Cool. And it's so powerful just to be, with your own people. Like we have these barriers, like psychosocial barriers that are in place, right? Like race and gender and culture. But when it comes to adopted people, the thing that's so interesting is that we all share such a common thread. And being able to connect and be validated by my people is really important. So thank you.
That sounds like a great group. I do a writing workshop and it's really intimate. But I'm the only adopted person, and we do a lot of writing prompts, so that just stuff comes out, like I never thought that blah, 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 that just a simple prompt. But lately, like a lot of my adoption stuff has been coming up, and I can just see on their faces just how, like they don't get it at all.
This group is like, oh my God, I get it. And then it's ran by Jennifer, is it Ghostin? Am I saying that correctly? She wrote a book. She's a Black woman. And then two other women that help run the group. And
will you send it to us and we'll put their information.
They do them like every quarter. So it's like, they do a series of, and it's all like writing about adoption. And it'll start with a writing prompt, like, what do you think about your adoption? How do you feel about your adoption?
I love that. In my group,
so
I'm laughing
with everything I never knew that I needed.
I'm laughing about what Sarah said, because a guy in my writing group actually said, "You're very wounded." Like this, and I'm like sitting there, like I'm like in a seniors one in the daytime. Great writers, but I'm definitely the only adoptee and the only. It just felt funny. I almost started laughing. Like, okay.
Also,
I'm gonna
keep that to yourself, sir.
Yeah, like
this guy always has something to say, but he said it in such a worried way, and I'm just like, okay. But then you can't be yourself. You can't totally be yourself while you're writing when you think someone's going to say that.
Exactly. So
I love it.
All right. Well, send us the information.
I will.
And we'll, do you want us to send people to your platform?
Yes, please.
Okay, great. So we'll put that in,
There's still a lot of great information on there.
It's great.
Yeah.
And still going. Yeah.
And you're funny.
Yeah. We'll send it.
Well, thank you so much, Nikole. Thanks for doing this with us.
You're welcome. Thank you both for having me. I appreciate
Thanks. We'll see you
soon.
We'll see you later.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye.